Keith was one of the most creative guys I've ever met. When we think of this, his entire Christian life was 8 years, total. He died quite young. I first met him in it's called FCCM, Fellowship of Christian Contemporary. It was actually originally Music Ministries. And it was quite a large thing. They had up to 500-600 people would come to that. But they were musicians, singers, but that particular one that also bring in sometimes street preachers, people who were bicyclists ministering to Hell's Angels, different kinds of groups. So Christian contemporary ministries. It wasn't all just music. But also there were people in there who were music producing owners, owner of Wood Records, owner of Sparrow, those kind of things. And they would come, so the real guys who actually ran those things would come because some of these new young songwriters or singers or bands had like a little 30-minute deal that they could play the best of their kind of music so that those the producer, record owner type people would decide, we'd like to, back you guys and print your stuff. Keith was brought in not as one of those guys, but as one that Sparrow Records had heard, and they're quite blown away by the uniqueness of his life. We have a little bit of footage of when he was small, and when he was 12 years old, he had a 3-record contract already as a pop singer. And he was Jewish, and his parents loved him. You find a Jewish family where they have a firstborn son who's a guy, very often they'll think that he might be the Messiah, the promised Messiah, just like Superman. Superman was done by a Jewish man, and the big bad guys in the first comics were the Nazis. And so Superman was Jewish Messiah. So this was what it was like. And I was asked to come to speak about revival. It's only a 3 or 4 day thing. And Keith was asked to sing as every night, to do, not a concert, 2 or 3 songs. First time I met Keith, I was very impressed by his hunger for God. He'd just pretty new Christian. He hadn't 20 years of Christian background. He and Melody got led to the Lord. An old Chinese guy witnessed to them, and so they both promised their lives to God, and then they're reading the Bible and trying to, what do we do? Love your enemies. Have we got any enemies? Love them and feed them. Okay, let's get some McDonald's, and we're going, that's how they did it. Like, okay, we did that, wasn't it? It was like that. So Keith came just to sing for these 3 or 4 days, and I was speaking on revival, what it looks like, what happens with people. Now the mix there, it wasn't a Pentecostal thing, it was a mix of different churches. Keith was somebody who had no Christian history at all. He had the Bible, but he didn't even know there was anything outside of what God did in his life. He knew that there was people that are saved, but he didn't know there was anything before that. So I just was trying to fill in some gaps and saying how big this thing God is and what he'd done before. But he was so hungry about that. After he'd sung and I preached and stuff, and we had something to eat, it was like 2, 3, 4 in the morning, 5. He's still talking, still asking questions. Then he would go to sleep and wake up at 12, and I would go out and work for the next 12 hours or something. But the time together was his intensity, and I just gave him whatever I could in that brief block of time. The wildest thing is we did have the Lord show up, and it was quite powerful. It was a Friday night, so it was quite near the end of the thing. But it was like Acts 1. Some heard sound of a rushing mighty wind. There was no wind outside, inside the thing. Some saw little flames on people's heads. It was everything except speaking in tongues. And I thought God was very kind on that, because there were some people, if there had been tongues, I would have thought, this is a demonic thing, I'm going to leave quickly. So God did everything except that. Amazing stuff. People weeping and, all kinds of exciting stuff. So Keith knew it's real. That thing happens. It can happen. It just happened now. So then there was a continual hunger to know more about that. He was still in LA, and every time people got saved, the church wouldn't take any kids from the street, wouldn't put them in their family, because they said, no, that's not our ministry. So he just kept buying houses to put them in. But when Faye and I went back home to New Zealand, we always flew from wherever we were back to LA and then on. And he asked us, could we stay or come down a day or two before we flew out? And just, it's probably as big as this thing here, and he had like 80 or 90 kids jammed into it, and just teach on different things. Then following day we'd fly out, and then we'd see him again next year. So the result of that ultimately was Keith moved the whole of Last Days. It got too big. There's too many kids. Couldn't just keep buying houses in LA, 100,000 for this one and stuff. So Keith's ministry was getting very, very powerful, and his songs took on a total new flavor. They weren't just nice songs like you saw in the little, when he's a kid. He was very creative and stuff, but that Keith Green never would have affected the world. What has started happening in his life, he began to be a revivalist. He began to see what sin was like. He began to be very powerful and honest, and his songs weren't just like singing. They were more like prophetic messages. And it shook people. It shook them in what he said and how he said it, and the way he said it. And even his thing on, he finally stopped charging for the things he did, and then he let people come in and whatever, for his, it just freaked people out. 40 Ways from Friday. They didn't know how to handle what was happening to him. But I love Keith and Melody. They had a wonderful, they moved the whole work. So they were right near us. They were just 5-10 minutes away from. So then they could drop over. And they also met David Wilkerson was there, and then Leonard Ravenhill had moved up. Some of the other musicians were there. Second chapter of Acts moved there. Dallas Home was there. Barry Maguire was there. It was all kinds. It became like a little, I don't know, Wheaton or something, People started coming. And then one of the most powerful things Keith did was he took over. You just met, a little earlier you met Bob Weiner. Bob would come, and others, maybe 30 to 40 people, would fly into a central location, like Dallas, and we'd rent a room there in the Dallas airport, and for a whole 2 days, we'd just share about different things and ask for prayer on different things. We call it the Artist Retreat, but it wasn't just musicians. It was people in charge of things, and they had to have prophetic heart, open to God, to whatever he's doing. And it became a wonderful deal. We met a lot of key people. Keith took the leadership of that once-a-year deal and called it the Garden Valley, it's where we lived, Artist Retreat. And we had up to 300 musicians, singers, songwriters, band people come from all over the country to come to that 2 or 3 day event. It usually started probably about a Monday, ran through till about a Wednesday or a Thursday. By Friday, most people had to leave because they had weekend concerts or weekend church things. But that was, again, a tremendously powerful thing. Just to see, you should have been listening to the worship, because you had these utterly amazing singers. None of them were leading anything. They were just singing. So Michael Jackson's We Are the World, this was We Aren't the World. And it was amazing. It just, somebody you never even heard of was helping lead the worship and stuff. And nobody had come with, this is the hot new song I'm doing, do you want to hear it? Just hanging out, the equivalent of C.S. Lewis's Inklings, when he met with J.R. Tolkien, and he met with Dorothy Sayers, and all these amazing, G.K. Chesterton, all these people they met with, something just a day, like once or maybe even in a couple of months they'd do it again, just to share what God had given them. Some were Anglican, some were Methodist, some, just different. Some were Catholic. They all came, hung out together, had a marvelous time. So I wanted to see that again. So the boil down of that is Keith became one of my best friends. We hung out with him, and my son, his best friend was Keith's little boy, Josiah. They learned to swim together in the same pool in one of the artist retreat things. They're only like a month separated in their time together. So when Keith had moved, they put a landing strip and a little, quite a marvelous little plane. Faye and I and William, little boy, flew with Keith's family all over the place, all over America, and it had ground-to-ground radar and ground-to-air. It was a very well done plane, and he had two pilots in the front. One of them was a Navy pilot, the same guy that landed on Navy ships during that kind of thing, and the other one was a missionary pilot, and he learned to fly a plane when he was like 12 years old, out in the jungles and landing in different places. So those were Keith's two pilots. And the most tragic thing that happened was when I was teaching in Dallas in Christ for the Nations. I was teaching on revival for a week in Christ for the Nations. And then I was going to finish on Friday night and then go out back home and then sort of hang out and stuff like that. And Keith had a family come and visit them, and he'd just parked the plane, filled it up with gas again, and this family arrived quite late, and he wanted to show them Last Days. It's huge. It was 400 acres. So just walking, you would never see it. It'd be too dark. So they got into the plane, and they asked the pilot, who was just having supper then, could you just take us up once and fly us over the top? And he was the Navy pilot. He was really an incredible pilot. So he didn't finish his, he just got in the plane. Keith packed in, the little kids. Most of them are small, just Keith and not Melody, and then this family and their children. And he had Josiah on his knee, and he was sitting in the other pilot's place in the front, because there were altogether about 6 or 8 of them or something in the plane. And something happened. We're not quite sure today what it was. But as the plane took off, the other pilot, had just finished his supper, he looked and he saw the windsock, which shows you which way the wind's blowing, had stuck. It was sort of stuck to itself. So he climbed up the thing to pull that out. And he was the only one who saw the crash. The plane, it seemed like this fast, they're called short take-up and landing, stall gear. And it comes like this, and the plane goes up very fast. The stall didn't come up. So it was going very slowly instead of a straight thing. He saw it. And then, as it was over the tops of the trees, but it's a lot lower than it normally is, and then it suddenly just dived. And smashed into the forest and blew up, and everybody died in the thing. The only ones left alive in Keith's family was Melody, and the child she was carrying, and the little girl that she had. And everybody else died. And I found that out when I was back in Dallas. I was just back, and there was a guy from Jack Hayford's church, his brother, and he was also speaking Christ for the Nations. He wanted to go and see Last Days. And I said, well, I'll take you out. Tomorrow we'll go out and see it. And the last moment, he found out he was supposed to be back Saturday and he couldn't go. So we cancelled it, or I would have been on that plane too, and so would have he. So when we came back in, I didn't know anything about this, and they'd moved the place I was staying to another place. So I'm sitting in there, and I saw the news at 6 o'clock. It said, in Tyler, Texas, there was a plane crash. The news in another hour. But I felt like a little bell ring in my heart. It was Tyler. We're in Lindale. We're half an hour away. There is a whole airport that the Baptists had their own planes and stuff right near Tyler. I thought, didn't say anything about the crash or anything else. So we came back to watch the news, and the first thing it said, last day's ministry. And I started to cry, because I realized that plane is Keith, and he died. So for the next 3 or 4 months, it was almost impossible. Wherever I went, people would come up and they'd be crying. They say, Keith died, and I'm crying too. I can't help it. So I saw the death of one of the most amazing men of this century, this previous century. It was an astonishing thing that in 8 years he did more than most people would have done in a lifetime. And his death was a shock to the whole world. But the last thing he did was a Jesus festival. And some of the footage of that was shot. And I think YWAM helped do this. But that little account was taken all over America and other places in the world. And thousands of kids signed up for the mission field just watching what had happened. And it wasn't about the crash. It was about Keith's last messages. So what did I feel about him? He was a very close friend. So I got to write his book, just the introduction to it. And I knew when I did it, Melody asked me, could you do the introduction to Keith's book? I knew when I did it, he wouldn't like anybody talking about how wonderful his life was. Because he really was a man who was willing to change things very fast. He'd come and say, what about this? And I'd say, well, it's good, but what about this thing, see? And he'd change everything overnight, just shift it like that. So when I did the foreword, I didn't write about him. I wrote about somebody else. I wrote about Martin Luther. And nobody saw that. I said, I'm thinking about a young man and how he affected the world. And then I talked at the end about some of his songs we still sing today, though it's 300 years ago. And then people are looking and go, what is he talking about? And I said, this is not actually a book about him, but somebody very much like him. That if what happened to this young man happened again to him, and that was the introduction to Keith. No Compromise will be a movie someday. We almost got it done. Real movie, not just a Christian documentary. Something like Walk the Line, something like Amazing Grace. But Keith's story is so amazing in itself that that'll be another thing that would really... The reason why the last one came out is because it didn't quite match what he really was like. We wanted a one that would honor God. People just pagan people looking at it would want to honor God too. I don't know if you've ever played Boggle, where you tip out these letters and you get, a minute, so sometimes 3 minutes to write as many words as you can from what you see. I'm pretty good at words. When those Reader's Digest, it pays to increase your word power, I do really well on those things. But Keith was ridiculously good. He would throw it, I don't know if we had a minute or 3 minutes or whatever you're given. So I'd write, I got maybe 10, 15 words. Keith would get like 30. He'd just be going, in a way, he's just writing. And I'm going, Keith, you can't be writing words. You can't be writing, see, and I look, and they are all real words. And the power of that is when you see his writing, because it's not like once I was lost and went down to the cross, and now Jesus is my boss, and I'm glad my name is Ross. It wasn't those kind of words. They were simple and profound. And that is so rare. People have to so complicated things, nobody can even remember anything. Or it's so corny, it's just da 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 da. But Keith's stuff was creative. I took him to Australia, these are extra little bits. Took him to Australia. He'd never been out of America before, not even to Canada, never traveled at all. Took him all the way to Australia. It's a 14-hour flight out of LA. And somebody had booked the Sydney Town Hall. That holds 2,000 people, okay? And it's the big cool town hall. It's got grand piano, Stein something. Anyway, he just off the plane, like a couple of hours, and he's playing in this deal. The majority of people who come are not Christians at all. They don't even know who he is. There's this guy, he's an awesome musician, singer, player, so let's go and listen to this guy. So Keith gets in, for the first 10 minutes, he's playing this piano. And there's this entire symphony thing that he's playing. Everybody goes, wow, I never heard that one before. He's practicing. He hadn't played for 3 or 4 days. He's practicing. And it isn't he's writing it. He's playing. And they all think, wow, what an incredible, what is that? I don't know, I never heard it before. So then, and then when he plays, it wasn't, stopping and preaching and then playing a tiny little song. He'd play and then he'd talk a little bit, and then he'd play again. And I watched this. Here's at least half the people, about 2,000 of them, in that Sydney town hall, pagans, all listening. Wow, they're not all going, oh, what are the exorcists and leaving. They're listening, see? So he's playing, he put this love in my heart, and he did all this things. But then there's this one. It's the Easter song, okay? Hear the bells ringing. He's playing this thing. And he didn't play, he thumped. He attacked like this, see that? So he's playing that, and he's got his own part of the lyrics, because it's a combined effort to do that song. And here's the second one. This is the one that he wrote. Hear the bells ringing, they're singing that you can be healed right now. When he played that chord, people got healed in the audience, listening, and they'd go, ah! And they'd grab what was hurt. It was amazing to see. He was not liking, oh, people are getting healed. He just kept playing. But it was power that was, the Spirit of God showed up in the middle of his concerts and started healing people from the message that he had in his song. So when people go, what is Keith Green like? And I say, it's exactly like his book says, no compromise. It had that picture of, some scary-looking Nebuchadnezzar on steroids freak guy, and this big, carried along by all the soldiers, and there's all these soldiers standing around, and everybody's down on their face, bowing before this huge, scary-looking fat figure being carried through the thing. And he's looking out, and there's one person standing in the whole middle of the crowd, and the people behind him are looking, oh, get down. And you just see his back, and he looks awfully like Jesus. And the guy's like pointing back, who is that? See that? And one single solitary figure in the middle of the crowd, no compromise. Just hundreds of thousands of people got affected by Keith. The saddest thing is, like years later, 20 years later, people don't know that he's dead. They just, wow, who did that song and stuff? So here's my son. He lost his best friend in that thing. But he couldn't remember any of the songs. He just knew Keith was Josiah's daddy. And so when he was 17, for almost a year, I listened to Keith Green again, because he found the songs and he played them again. That was amazing. Just totally amazing stuff.